Hello, am I visible and audible? I think, I don't know if the lighting is really bad. Hold on. Okay, give me a few seconds to start my timer. Hello, am I visible and audible? I think, I don't know if the lighting is really bad. Hold on. Okay, give me a few seconds to start my timer. Am I visible and audible?
Yeah, you are loud and clear. Can you try read the motion so that I know your internet status, whether it is okay or lagging?
Okay, this house regrets the narrative that a good life is one lived selflessly.
I think that's clear enough. All right, in this situation is lag, I'll intervene. With that, the floor is yours.
Okay. Um, don't have any preferred pronouns. I prefer my POIs to chat, so because I will most likely will not be. Okay, I prefer my POIs to chat. Uh, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The sense of self and your own dignity is the most important thing within your own life, and is the prerequisite to having a good life. Because without the sense of dignity and self, no other means and actions can come from that. Because living a good life is subjective, but still come best from achieving the sense of self and self-happiness. But also can come from helping others, which will prove why that is not the inherent meaning of acting selflessly. This debate cannot be about the obligation of helping others, because by virtue of you needing to be selfless, you know that you are doing something that you don't want, therefore not fulfilling your best life. The narrative itself is the one that is harmful within society, because that is the underlying factor that puts pressure on people to sacrifice their own terms. A few pieces of setup before moving on to my substantives. Firstly, on what this necessarily means within a good life. It means that it is still always going to be subjective, but also puts emphasis on the importance of living a more holistic well-being, and we will put emphasis on significance of things like emotional fulfillment, contentment, and a sense of purpose, and shifting the focus from oneself to the more well-being of other, as well as the individuals can attain a sense of true happiness and lead a good life down the line anyway. And what does necessarily living a selfless life look like? It looks like putting others' needs before your own, and actively prioritizing the needs and happiness of others over one's own. And this looks like kindness, showing empathy and compassion and sacrifice for the greater good, for the greater good of other people. We have to set the grounds that living life selflessly isn't necessarily a bad thing, but not a bad thing in the slightest. However, we still say that selflessness can still exist on both sides of the house, because we can still have people will be selfless from things like voluntarily helping others on your own time, feeling love and compassion towards others, therefore wanting the best for them and not sacrificing your own needs to meet the needs of other people. And however, the narrative itself is the one that pushes people to act selflessly out of their own volition and not by choice, and act out of obligation, and by virtue of obligation to mean you aren't necessarily living the best life that you can. The world in which we operate in has to be a world where people have had this narrative drilled in them, because that is the only thing that has to happen to even allow for this debate to have any sort of impact down the line. And with that narrative, who lives a better life? Two pieces of substantives that I'll be forwarding within my speech. Firstly, on how it is our proposition side is the only side that protects people's and individuals' liberty, and secondly, how this acts as societal pressure that is unhealthy within a person's life anyway. Firstly, on the point of who better protects liberties of individuals. You're actively choosing to want to help others, not out of your own volition. What we achieve on our side is two things. Firstly, is individual agency, and secondly, is personal growth and development. What does individual agency necessarily look like and achieve? Recognizing personal agency does not negate the value of selflessness, but in fact, it empowers individuals to make a more autonomous choices and enables them to engage in acts of kindness from a place of genuine willingness and rather than obligation. And by respecting personal autonomy, we encourage individuals to take their own ownership of their actions and have a more profound impact on the lives of others as well, because you're still able to do all those things and still be able to have more of individual agency anyway. And second, on the point of being able to achieve personal growth and development even more on our side of the house. Firstly, and we are able to enhance our capacity for selflessness by continuously developing our own skills and knowledge and abilities. We can better serve others and make a more significant impact, and being able to have both a good quality of life and therefore also being able to help other people in the same on our own terms and in the same terms. And personal growth should not be seen as a contradictory to selflessness, but rather as a means to become more effective in our acts of kindness and support. When we prioritize our own well-being, we cultivate the necessary resilience and strength to support others effectively. By empowering individuals to take care of themselves, we enable them to sustain their own capacity for selflessness and contribute to the well-being of others in a more sustainable and impactful manner. And even if opposition tries to act on the grounds of being selfless, we still say that being selfless isn't necessarily a bad thing. However, selflessness should be something that is voluntary. You wouldn't necessarily feel the constant obligation and ill will that comes with being selfless if you are willing to do it voluntarily. What this means is that if you make a selfless action, you know you are being selfless, and that means you're actively suppressing your own needs. This looks like you knowing you're being selfless by helping your own father at work. However, you actively sacrificing the potential joy and time spent with your friends. And the harm comes on opposition, where you actively think you need to be selfless. There are certain things that you need to do that there are certain things that you need to do out of your own obligation. Before moving on to my second substantive POI.
The prop stance can't be, we don't want this narrative because we want people to be genuinely selfless. That just crosses the debate into all. You have to defend a world where people opt for selfish interests with a lack of this counter narrative on opposition.
We've already given you extensive amounts of analysis that selflessness doesn't necessarily mean needing to being able to achieve a good life doesn't necessarily mean actively needing to be selfless all the time. And we've already told you that if you want to actively be selfless, therefore you know that you are actively doing something that you don't want to do, because you actively know, oh, I'm being selfish in this current situation, therefore not as necessarily achieving the good life that you want to achieve, which we've already given you analysis on that. Second point on my societal pressure. The narrative is more likely to dictate an oligarchy of opinion that shapes how individuals think and treat themselves in the long scale of things. In the event where this narrative is in place, what this means is that there is higher likelihood to have a higher bias to want to live this life in the first place. Why is this necessarily true? Opposition's benefits have to contend on a world where this narrative is instead wide scale. This means that they cannot say that the narrative cannot be held close by individuals on their side. And when this is the instant, by virtue of proximity and societal bias, more and more people will instead opt into this idea that they have to stick with this belief to prevent them from being seen as completely different and being seen as completely out of the norm, and so on and so forth. And what this looks like is an increasing amount of selfless individuals who do not put their own needs first. And this societal pressure undermines the value of helping others in the first place. And this is especially harmful in the following circumstance. In instances where you aren't really able to help other people, that you will still be pressured by people to actually still put yourself first, put yourself before others, because this narrative is likely to be very imposing on the people's people's active wanting to help other people. And secondly, very self-regulating, because by virtue of what we tell you in the framing itself already. And in the instance where you have been historically oppressed and disenfranchised, you still are expected to be upheld to this standard. What on the comparative side, the best case of side opposition's world is likely to have individuals choosing to help others instead your capability either way. But even on the worst case of proposition, we consolidate liberty and the authority of individuals on the ground by reducing societal pressure. You can live however you want without worry, and therefore side with the side that necessarily will lead you to a better good life in the long term. With that, I propose.
All right, thank you for the fine speech. Now to invite leader of opposition.
Hi, can I get a moment to set up my timer?
Sure, ready when you are.
All right, thank you. Okay. Am I audible?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay. My pronouns are she, her. POIs, I would prefer for them to be taken verbally. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I think that when I'm on my deathbed under the musky, flickering fluorescent hospice LED lights, I'm not going to remember the time that I blew off my friends in order to go to a Coldplay concert. I don't think I'm going to remember the time that I sold out my best friend's secret because of the chance that I was going to get like in a bad situation. I think I'm going to remember the time that my friends were happy that I actually managed to show up to those meetings. I think I will remember the times that my family was happy that I was there for them instead of going to instead of going out with my friends. I think I would be happy to know that I lived a good life serving the people that I like because I managed to not even just enrich their life. I managed to make mine even better, knowing that they love me, that I love them, and I'm willing to show that, right? So I think before I go into my rebuttals and my arguments, I have a couple of framing here as to what the implications of this narrative would look like. So as children, I think we're taught to be less selfish, right? And this principle is ingrained in us since childhood. And a lot of our decision making from this ultimately becomes largely selfless. I think I have to place a very important emphasis here as to why children become self-sacrificing in the name of selfless interest. So I think first of all, we have to establish that the notion of self-sacrificing, it ultimately serves no one, right? I think any rational actor knows this. You're worthless to both yourself and the team or the people that you serve if you are burnt out and tired. I think ultimately here, the quality of your work goes down. I think productivity goes down because I think number one, I don't think your parents will teach you to not like to self-sacrifice to the extent where you're burnt out and tired. I think they love you enough to not want to see you suffer. I don't think that the sentiment of selfless living here is going to ever override the boundaries of things like mental health. And even if they teach you to do so, I think that the team you're working with or your friends that you're working with in the effort to achieve that collective interest will know this and who will stop you. I think that third of all, this is meant to perform as a corrective narrative in our side of the house, right? Because I think humans are inherently selfish beings. I think that we function as nomads and solitary beings insofar as that we are not taught or inspired from young to be selfless. I think that we are likely to function as selfish beings insofar as, for example, if a child isn't taught to share from young, I don't think they're going to be likely to share their toys. So I think here that the burden on our side today is very simple. We're simply going to prove to you today why people who develop selfless mindsets tend to live happier and more fulfilled lives. I also need to assert here that proposition absolutely cannot take a soft stance on this case today, and that their actual burden here is to defend the idea of A, parents teaching their children to place their interests first and foremost in their lives all the time, or B, parents leaving their children to learn to prioritize all of this themselves, which would look like them not teaching them to share their toys and leaving it up to the 3-year-old with no social perceptive ability to understand that snatching the ball away from their friend was a bad thing. So notice, panel, that these are net harms. We think that to teach your children that no matter the circumstance or the privilege, that their interests will always come first. Who cares about everyone else? It's inherently a bad stance to take on your parenting, and to allow your child to run blind in life is a letdown to them as well. You think that this ultimately results in horrible perceptions of who or what they have to prioritize in life, leading to them having difficulty in managing their interpersonal relationships and their work image. We don't stand for this, and I think I'll leave this up to second prop to defend this notion. So I think that them allow the majority of their case in Prop 1 was essentially like encouraging individual agency and personal growth and development. We actually don't think that this happens on their side of the house because yes, I think that things, I'll take that later, things like empathy exist, but I think proposition needs to take the hard stance at some point in this debate. They need to come to the conclusion that with a lack of narrative to push people into being significantly more selfless, they were never going to be able to actually get genuine side of change on their side of the house today. So I have one argument today on our side of the house, right, as to why this narrative leads to positive development of interpersonal relationships. So I have a couple of layers here. The first of all being the development of interpersonal relationships become much more enriched on our side of the house, because I think interpersonal relationships can exist within multiple instances. We think that this looks like relationships with your significant others, familial relationships, those with your friends. I think that relationships in status quo will ultimately function upon an intuitively collective interest mindset, which is meaning to say that the most relationships function in a world where all members of that relationship need to work together to make this work out, right? So I think in a relationship with a significant other, it won't work out if one person is more interested in their pursuing their selfish interests rather than doing something that will benefit the both of you, because in that instance, they're not thinking of you. They're not thinking of the effects that them pursuing those interests will have on you. I think this ultimately corrodes and corrupts your relationship. I also think that selfless interests work better in the context of interpersonal relationships because ultimately people are more drawn to you. Because honestly, no one wants to hang out or collaborate with a selfish person. I think this actually increases your capacity for friendship and romantic relationships because you're seen as a person who's willing to do things for your friends, who's willing to stand by them, and you're seen as someone who's first and most importantly a reliable and stable force. They know that they can count on you to keep their secrets and to show up and to stand by your commitments with them. We think this absolutely enriches your relationships. And in workplaces, if you have to work with a person who is inherently selfish and or is actively or secretly competing with you, we think that unless this is a friendly rivalry, this only serves to sour your relationship and to sour the personal bonds or projects that you're soon to work with them. And we think the second layer here, and a very important one, is upon the development of one's career. We have a two-pronged analysis here as to the employment process and the opportunities in your career, right? Because we think corporate culture or working culture in basically every single industry right now and in the future functions on an entirely collective interest mindset, which is that employers are more inclined to push the whole group dynamic and mindset. I think that examples of this are things like companies hosting group retreats and resorts, organizing group outings, encouraging work to be done within groups. So you got at the division of labor and still unification of the workplace. I'll say that later. I think that the most important reason here as to why they do this is likely because it's much more easy to keep the corporate wheels running insofar as there is a division of labor. Because in here, managing becomes much more easier because handing out assignments is significantly easier and more time is saved. We think that this intention further implicates into working culture in so many more ways. And a very important clarification that must be made in this debate is that at the end of the day, receiving selfish benefit is not the same thing as pursuing selfish interest. There's no definite chance you get benefit out of pursuing selfish interest, rather than the comparative here is doing things like actively and passionately participating in a group setting gets you things like promotion and better image, which ultimately enriches your life in the process. Yes, I'll take that.
We told you that people are still able to help others out of their own will. If you are calling us out for having an unfair burden and framing, please also contend on the idea that it's possible for individuals to want to help others out of their own will.
I think that's more possible, yes, but I don't think that if you told a child, if you didn't grow up telling a child that they should be sharing things, I think that this ultimately is a selfish burden that they will take onto themselves. I think that ultimately, like all your caveman instincts from like when you had to like, you know, to strip that mammal bear and just like eat it for yourself. I think that kind of instinct corrodes you because you don't have parents telling you things like, no, I don't think you should be taking like that toy away from Timothy. I think you should be like sharing with him because ultimately it makes him very sad. I think children are less perceptive to emotional change than adults or teenagers are because we are experienced in the world, right? And we understand the effect that this can have on relationships. I don't think a 3-year-old is going to understand that by taking away like a toy from his friend, it's ultimately going to make him less popular. That's the problem on your side of the house today, that your parents and that your like siblings are not teaching you this sort of thing from the start, or rather letting you develop this from the start and also getting corroded ideas about this. And then, okay, anyway, continuing with my argument, I think that the employment process here, right, is ultimately that employers are more likely to look out for people who have better track records of working in large groups or from companies that have a really group heavy lifestyle right from the beginning. Because I think they want to ensure that the candidates that they're employing are going to be team players and are going to be helpful in their company in that sense. But I think maybe, sure, you get some of the off the hook in the employment process, right? But what about the employment opportunities that you have while working? Because I think as soon as you start working in whichever company that you're in, you start functioning as a vessel, as a self-interested person. So absolutely avoiding group assignments because that's a collective interest. It helps out others and you're against that. So I think that you're more likely to work into individual goals, and this is going to send signals to employers, managers, supervisors. They understand that you're not necessarily someone who can be counted on because you're not a team player and you're more self-centered. You're going to be passed down more for promotion and in managerial roles. You're going to be passed down in terms of assignments and projects because these are not things that you're interested in collaborating with. We think this ultimately dilutes your potential as a worker, as a friend, as a family member, and I think side with the team here that advocates for this positive change in your life, that advocates not just for positivity in your personal relations, but in your workforce, because that's the thing that matters most. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you for the fine speech. Just to keep speakers in check to always speak within the time frame. Even more than that, we will not take note. With that being said, I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
All right, give me a minute, please. Thank you. Sorry. All right. Am I audible?
Yep, you're loud and clear.
All right, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Before I start, I would like to start with a couple of rebuttals. The other side of the house said that people are more drawn to selfless individuals that are known as preferred collaborators. First, we tell you that it's not true. While it may be true that selfless individuals can attract others due to their generosity and altruism, it does not necessarily mean that self-interested individuals are undesirable collaborators. Collaborative efforts are often based on shared goals, skills, and complementary strengths rather than solely on selflessness. In fact, self-interested individuals can bring valuable skills, innovative ideas, and strategic thinking to collaborations, making them equally valuable partners. Number 2, the assertion that people are more drawn to selfless individuals does not imply that self-interested individuals are entirely excluded from collaborations. Interpersonal relationships are multi-phased, and factors such as shared interests, expertise, and effective communication play a significant role in collaboration. While selflessness can be an attractive quality, it should not be the sole determining factor in evaluating someone's ability to contribute to successful collaborations. The other side of the house also mentioned that selfish individuals are secretly competing with you. It is an oversimplification to assume that self-interested individuals are constantly engaged in covert competition. In collaborative settings, individuals often recognize the value of cooperation and mutually beneficial outcomes. Self-interest can drive us as individuals to actively seek win-win situations, negotiate fair terms, and strive for collective success. Collaboration does not necessarily require selflessness. It thrives on effective communication, mutual respect, and the pursuit of shared objective between both sides. Number 2, in some contexts, a healthy level of competition can actually be motivating and lead to increased productivity and innovation. If the other side of the house insists that what we are trying to debate is about being selfish and not have a certain extent of selflessness, then they are wrong. Self-interested individuals may strive to excel and bring their best to collaborative efforts, driving positive outcomes for everyone who's involved. As long as the competition remains constructive and does not undermine the spirit of collaboration, it can enhance overall performance and contribute to the success of collective endeavors. Next, we will also rebut on parents teaching children that snatching other kids' ball is a good thing. It's not true. Why? Because the claim that parents actively teach children to be selfish and endorse harmful behaviors like snatching balls is an extreme generalization. Responsible parents prioritize teaching empathy, kindness, and respect for others, while occasional self-centered behavior in children is part of their development process. Number 2, assuming that some parents may accidentally promote self-centered behaviors, children's value are shaped by a broader range of experiences. Their peers, educators, teachers, and societal norms help mitigate and balance any negative teachings, fostering empathy and understanding in these children. Next, we also tell you the potential harm of teaching children selfishness in my previous speech, right? Teaching children to be selfish is not a prevalent or accepted practice among responsible parents. Why? Because in our side, parents aim children, in both sides, we aim to raise children who understand the importance of considering others' needs and collaborating, but we also have to be aware of some sort of extent of selfishness that we have to protect ourselves and also improve ourselves in order to collaborate with others better, right? The other side said that we are being uncharitable, but then they want us to defend a world where suddenly everyone would snatch balls from little kids and everyone would suddenly actively act so selfishly that no one will like you. There is still innate feelings or wanting to help others by the virtue of us being social creatures, wanting to find love. Even if that we take their uncharitable stance, we still are the side that is better, able to achieve the good life, because why? You still focus on yourself and be happy, and actively doing what you want. And therefore, if you want friends, you still would make them, right? If you still want to make a lot of money, you are still going to do them. But the narrative of being selfless, you will still not want to strive for those things. It's absolutely wrong. Now, I would like to move on to the other argument on our side. Argument 3, diversity and inclusivity in defining a good life. Number 1, cultural and individual differences. Recognizing and embracing diverse paths to a good life allows us to appreciate the richness and complexity of human experiences. Different culture, different belief systems, and personal backgrounds shape individuals' perspective on what constitutes a fulfilling life. For example, as I've mentioned previously, it's not about the parents teaching the children that snatching balls are good. It's about the people around them, when they grow up, the experience they have, right? So by acknowledging and respecting these differences, we create an inclusive society that values and celebrates the various ways individuals contribute to the well-being of others. Some may find fulfillment through acts of selflessness, while others may have alternative approaches to making a positive impact, such as advocating for social justice. Embracing this diversity of paths to a good life enriches our collective understanding and fosters a society that respects and supports individual autonomy and choice. Number 2, personal value and happiness. Each individual like us possesses a unique set of values and beliefs that guides our actions and define our sense of fulfillment. It's important to recognize that acts of selflessness can align with personal values and contribute to individual happiness. We need to identify our core values and pursue acts of kindness that resonate with our beliefs. Then we create a more authentic and meaningful approach to selflessness. Why? Because something that is good to you, you think that your act of selflessness may lead to a better life of other people and ourselves. But actually, in real life, maybe people don't think that it's something good for them. Maybe it's bad for them. They don't like this. So embracing diverse sources of meaning and happiness acknowledges that selflessness can be a personal and fulfilling choice, but it should not be the only path to a good life. Next, we tell you well-being of relationships. Prioritizing personal relationships does not diminish the significance of selflessness. Rather, it recognizes the interdependence between personal well-being and acts of kindness. Healthy and meaningful relationships are essential for overall well-being and can serve as a foundation for acts of selflessness. By nurturing and investing in these relationships, individuals cultivate empathy, trust, and compassion, which in turn enhance their ability to support and positively impact others. Recognizing the importance of personal connections emphasizes that acts of selflessness are more effective when grounded in strong, mutually beneficial relationships. When in the first place, we focus on ourselves first. We focus on improving ourselves first. It promotes a holistic understanding of a good life where personal well-being and the well-being of others are intertwined and mutually reinforcing. With that, I'm proud to propose. Thank you.
All right, thank you for the fine speech. Now to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Am I audible?
Yep, you're loud and clear. The floor is yours.
POS verbally, pronounced here. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel. Could you imagine if on the day Martin Luther King marched on Washington, D.C. and delivered his famed I Had a Dream speech, but it wasn't actually about the collective interest of oppressed African Americans, but it was just about a dream he had for himself, and it was all about his own selfish interests. That's the world God has to live in, and that's the world they have to defend. They genuinely can't come up here and tell us that, people are going to be selfless anyways, even if we don't have that narrative. I think this just ends up breaking this debate, and they enter our debate and argue our case for us. I'm going to engage with the two broader clashes that came from Gov here. Firstly was on their stance itself, which I found problematic right from the start of the debate. I think Prop tried to weasel out of this debate really easily. They tried to come up with this stance saying, we don't have to defend any narrative in particular, we don't have to push any narrative in particular, but still people are going to be selfless. This is problematic for two main reasons. One, it takes down a large proportion of their case to begin with. Because Prop argues too that being selfless itself is a net harm, in the sense that people end up putting themselves up for, like, literally self-sacrificing themselves, putting their own like other individual interests over their own personal interests. They argue too that being selfless is a harmful thing to begin with, and that's why we need to, in some instances, prioritize ourselves. So then I'm unclear as to what's the difference between our case and their case. Secondly, I don't actually think they can defend this stance, because note how the selflessness that they claim on their side of the house is a functional benefit from our world and our narrative to begin with. You can't argue that individuals are going to function on their own self-will and be selfless insofar as there's a lack of narrative. Because my first speaker gave you clear and concise analysis on as to why human beings are individualistic individuals and are going to be likely selfish upon born, like as soon as they are born. I think you can see this with things like behavior of children. You can see this in the behavior of children who are typically, like they don't really have siblings, or their parents never really taught them to share to begin with. You're likely to see this translate into things like adulthood. So I'm unclear on as to why then these people are still going to be wanting to be selfless in the long term, and as to why then this just doesn't enter our debate. But secondly, on the idea of an oligarchy of opinion and how this discriminates some groups of people, I think firstly as to why is an oligarchy of opinion likely to exist on both sides of the house, right? Judge, we think that Op again can't get away without pushing with a lack of counter narrative, right? We think that just breaks the debate. They had to defend a world where the lack of a presence of a narrative that is a selfless narrative ended up pushing for things like selfishness. So it made way for an ensuing counter-narrative. But why is this exclusively true? I think this is largely because of things like the integration of the narrative and messaging that exist in our side of the house, in things like popular media, and even in like media that children consume. So in the movies, the moral of the story is then it's better to work together as a group rather to work solo. So I think this lack of a narrative in like prop side of the house is likely, I'm inclined to believe that then you see a shift to an alternative narrative. So the one that pushes for things like selfish, self-prioritizing interest, where we look out for things like personal interest rather than collective interest. So the oligarchy of opinion still exists on your side of the house because you genuinely can't define a narrative absent world. I'm inclined to believe that that's genuinely true. But I'll explain to you on the comparative why even if the oligarchy exists, what ours is significantly likely better on our side of the house. But then my first extension here on why a selfless narrative leads to the development of a better society in general. First layer quickly on as to why society functions in status quo right now, and an intuitively selfless interested mindset. I think you can take a good look at this when it comes to things like social justice causes. So you see collective interests are exclusively what are pursued, where it's not the goal of one individual minority, but more so the goal of an entire minority itself. It's not as so I think insofar as things like social justice groups start functioning selfishly, trying to pursue their own individual aims of individual minorities, I think that's when social justice movements begin collapsing. Because you see social justice leaders start using their movements to try and pursue their own individual aims. So they start trying to pursue their own individual aims by getting things like government positions, trying to get close and buddy up with the government, and at the end of the day, secure their own self-interest while significantly screwing over the larger minority. So I think then the idea is you no longer get that same reach that you were once able to do so with these social justice movements. Because right now, they're able to expand far and wide messages with this whole idea of a selfless interest. So BLM and things like the Me Too movement are able to expand all the way from the US, all the way to countries like China, which is what we think is amazing. But once we become so much more self-interested and so much more selfish, we're likely to break down that connection. Because you start seeing this idea of, aha, it's happening in another country, why should I care? Why should I have a genuine interest in something that doesn't affect me? I think that's the kind of mindset that OP has to defend. Because note how this directly coincides with your idea of you don't want to face any form of self-harm, you don't want to self-sacrifice your individuality, and hence you choose to be selfish, and that's why you shouldn't be selfless. So in those instances, when you see things like situations of police brutality, you're likely to not have a direct outrage, you're likely to not participate in things like protests and things like social movements, because that's self-sacrificing for you as an individual, that's putting your time in the wrong place. So I think that's where you start seeing social justice leaders starting to try and work their own individuality and their own self-benefit, like lining their pockets, trying to make their own lives better, and the future of these movements start falling apart. But before I move on to my next extension, I'll take a few.
Do you think morality is directly proportional to what selflessness is in today's debate?
Because selflessness is part of your morality as an individual. I think it links to your character as an individual. And if you aren't taught selflessness, I'm inclined to believe that in a certain degree, your morality is likely to be shrouded. Second extension then, on the comparative of these two narratives and why the manifestation of a selfless interest in society is likely to be far more beneficial. I think it's quite simple in this debate. on Gov, by regretting the narrative of a selfless interest, they had to either end up defending A, a narrative that pushes for selfish interest, or B, the entire lack of a narrative in and of itself, which my first speaker told you were both going to be problematic at the end of the debate. Well, what's the comparative between the two and how it's exactly interpreted? I think we want to talk about the manifestation of a selfless narrative itself in things like kids. So I think it's likely to manifest from a much younger age. So we talked to you earlier about how children are likely to be, how children are likely, without being taught how to be selfless and more considerate, you're likely going to lead to a manifestation of things like selfish activity, selfish goals, things like ultimately you're not going to end up with people who are likely going to support you because you surround yourself with other people who are also self-centered and self-interested. I think then this comes into contention with the idea of competition, because I think the idea of competition is largely shrouded. I think competition exists insofar and is only a beneficial form of competition insofar as people are able to come together with things like collective interests. If you're going to be competing against individuals as your own, I think that it just becomes an entire shit show. I think then you're not unable to, like as kids, you're not able to find people who will support you one day. You're not able to surround yourselves with people who are able to support you by virtue of the fact you're likely going to be far more selfish. I think then when it comes to the manifestation of selfishness in adults, in result of not being taught things like selflessness from young, or not having that narrative to push you into being significantly much more selfless, I think then you end up doing things like internalizing these concepts of selfishness from a much younger age. You're never really taught how to counter that with genuine selfishness, with genuine selflessness, and selflessness is not something you need to be better. Something you need to be better. Your workplace life gets significantly better. Your interpersonal relationships with things like your children and your kids tend to get typically better. So I think when it comes to interpersonal relationships, you then people start getting like families on God's side of the house just for the pursuance of their own individual self-benefit and happiness. It's no longer about trying to raise a child, no longer about trying to provide a child with a happy home. So then we argue that this selflessness is completely essential in children that don't consent to being born, and in the world of prop where you don't owe people anything and therefore you get to do whatever you want. We think this is a good principle to have as a parent, but you owe it to your child to sacrifice everything and do things for their own good, because at the end of the day, they never consented to being born. I think then the lack of this narrative on proposition side of the house effectively leads to a lot of narcissistic personalities when it comes to parenting. It leads to significantly under-neglected children. I think for all those reasons, you have to side with us.
All right, thank you for the fine speech. Now to invite the government whip.
Hello, just to confirm, am I audible?
Yeah, you're loud and clear, ready when you want.
Okay, give me a sec. Okay, before I start my speech, I'd like to clarify, PY is verbal. I won't be turning on my camera, mainly because of my internet issues. As for pronoun preference, I don't really have any. Just refer to me as the government whip and you should be fine. All right, with that, hold up. Why is this? Right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Don't let opposition's examples skew you away from the actual framing in today's debate. Individuals like Nikola Tesla or other people who actually work towards scientific discovery never opted into these struggles because they wanted to for some reason they wanted to sacrifice themselves for the sake of science or whatever. And note that most development was out of wanting to push out of your own boundaries in the fact of self-interest and in the fact of wanting to achieve your own self-actualization in the first place. Well, we tell you that to an extent, even if we concede to what opposition's framing posits to you, that we on side proposition are still able to weigh over them in today's debate. Because no, right now, if you're going to say that everything most things that people do exist out of selflessness, we can also I can also posit to you a lot of examples while not giving any actual analysis what opposition decides to do in today's debate. But then moving on to a few strategic mistakes that they commit before going on to 2 clashes that I think are fairly important in today's debate. But first then, 1, opposition's framing just doesn't make sense. They tell you right now that the reason as to why individuals are going to be completely selfish in our side of the house are because of the following reasons. 1, because 3-year-old is unable to understand what it is like to want to act in self-interest while still helping others. There were likewise, if you were to assume that 3-year-olds truly were as irrational and illogical as they say, and their formative years are mostly comprised of them trying to understand why it is important to help other people on our side and why it is important to prioritize yourselves on their side, we still say that the individuals in their formative years on side of opposition is likely to be subjected to the same form of misunderstanding. So we say that even if this is the case, let's assume the worst case on both sides. One, note that even if our side has individuals who are in fact selfish and individuals who, on the worst case that we assume that they are in fact acting purely out of self-interest, we still say that these children are more than likely to still be able to conform to what societal cohesion pushes you in today's debate. Because understand right now, while opposition keeps pushing the idea that selflessness is directly equating to some form of self-governing morality system, they also concede to you that morality is still existent on our side. Morality and whatnot still exists in tandem with what can exist on our side of the house, which note, when this is the case, people don't necessarily act out of selflessness on their side, because note that trying to stop things like police brutality or potential discrimination and trying to fix things like gender equality mostly don't just stem out of your own self-interest from being in that demographic. It doesn't just stem from being wanting to have a collective belief as well. It also stems from some self-regulating sense of justice that humans want to push, which is why we say most of opposition's framing on how social movements need selflessness is likely to be untrue. Even if we were to be charitable and assume that this is the case, we tell you that this is very much still not exclusive to their side, which is something that virtually just takes out a huge chunk of their argumentation. Because note that on today's debate, we are still likely to have more individuals who are self-driven, who are actually willing to push out of conformity to actually fight for what they think is right themselves. Because note that most social movements didn't just start off as being something inherently collective. Sure, people banded together, but they banded together because of their self-interest, not because they had that sense of selflessness off the bat. So even if we assume that to be true on side opposition, we still have we still can call up the benefits that they tell you as well. Number two, on why self-interested individuals can still help others in today's debate. One, on society, note that everything is seen as having an underlying purpose. There are a lot of factors that drive individuals to actually want to work with others, but not all of them exist out of selflessness. Number two, collaboration does not require selflessness. Even if you assume this to be true, it still it's still mostly asserted on side of opposition, mainly because both their first and second speaker don't actually tell you as to why the analysis is true. They don't actually tell you why, by virtue of me wanting to sacrifice myself for the greater good, that I would be very much likely to want to align with other people off the bat. But even then, we tell you that self-interest is also a driving factor if we assume their best case, because self-interest still drives individuals to want to cooperate, and that's what most projects started off as. People wanting to do something of passion, people wanting to do something out of their own own choice and free will, and not just wanting to, oh, someone didn't do this, I will fill that in for them, because that's not how it works. So moving on, understand that if people have no genuine interest in things that do not harm me, that's not really true. Because to an extent, even if you were to assert that humans have some degree of humans have some weird degree of not having empathy, and sure, even if that is the case, that empathy is a taught trait, morality still exists as a check and balance on our side and can coexist with altruism. So what this means is that what they say isn't going to be true either. But then moving on to my first clash, on which side actually has individuals who have better growth in today's debate. 3 layers under this. One, we say that better growth is only possible on side proposition in the instance where helping others is out of your own choice. Because note, while they keep telling you the only reason as to why people won't be helping others is because they won't understand what self-interest, they won't understand what helping others out of self-interest is. We say that if they can teach them the same things that they assert, we can also teach them the same things that we assert. So what this means is that coexisting norms can still exist because of all the framing that we've already told you, and they don't actually contend on that. But even if we contend on their framing instead, we still win over. Because number two, in a world where social cohesion is constantly pressured even without this narrative, allowing for liberty to take precedence in our way, in our world, is the only good way to actually still have growth in today's debate. This is because of the following. One, in the framing that we give you, people helping others out of their own will is still going to be better because one, what you are able to do out of your own compassion, of your own choice, is still going to be infinitely better than what other people force you to do. But okay, before I move on to second layer, are there any POIs?
At its worst case, assuming that people lack compassion on both sides of the house, why does it still matter then if the selflessness comes behind some form of compassion? Isn't it still selfless at the end of the day, even if people lack compassion on our side of the house?
If people lack compassion on your side of the house, then that just basically proves all the harms of individuals doing things out of that social obligation, which my first speaker has already told you as to why it's harmful, because it already, like, that just conforms to the fact that you are already conforming to an oligarch of opinion. But then moving on, number two, even if you assume the framing of opposition and we say on our worst case versus their best case, we still win for the following reasons. One, we tell you that individuals acting in their own interest isn't really bad in the first place, because most of opposition's case still doesn't contend on how people like have that form of drive to actually want to do things, like, because most of the examples don't really tell you as to how selflessness is inherently good. It just mostly tells you that people band together based on their own interests. So we say that we are able to flip that analysis. But then moving on to a second minor clash in today's debate, on which side actually has better cooperation and benefit, and is selflessness still more important than self-sustenance? One, note that even if our side concedes to the idea that collaboration is something based on selfless virtue, the reason you would even opt into social justice movements is in the event where you want to have self-protection then. So we say that even if opposition tells you all these benefits about like social justice and all that social cohesion, that we are still able to co-opt that, which is why the only side that actually is able to ensure that individuals on the ground have the baseline growth for self-actualization and development is still on side of proposition, where we tell you that individuals will be living out of their own volition and choice, which is why we say side with prop. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you for the fine speech. Now to invite the upward.
Alright. Give me some time to set up my timer. My pronouns are she, her, and I'll be taking my POIs verbally. Alright, so I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Once upon a time in a land far, far away, there was a little boy named Devesh. He used to fight tooth and bone with his cousin for 5 minutes with a Nintendo. He used to scream at his mother for not letting him eat cake past 10 p.m. He used to punch his little classmates in the eye because they wouldn't lend him a pencil. Of course, Saigov can easily say he's just a kid. He has all the time to work out a moral grounding and a moral foundation later on. But again, the average child has no social perception whatsoever. They have no ability to dissect and analyze these situations and derive any real formative lessons from them, unless a teacher or a figure of authority reprimands him and teaches him that he can't be selfish. With that, let's see what my side has contributed to this debate thus far. First, we told you about how this will lead to the positive development of interpersonal relationships. And our first layer was about the development of interpersonal relationships and how this narrative of selfishness reinforces negative concepts and sentiments. If government once arose without this narrative, we asked what would be their alternative. So we said that they either have to defend children just developing their own incentives or entirely pushing for the promotion or propagation of selfishness as a mindset. If we argue on their best case scenario, which is the former, children are impressionable and immature and easily influenced. This means that if parents don't equip them with any kind of moral compass whatsoever, it means they can be surrounded by situations in which they have to prioritize themselves and put their selfish interests first and foremost. Like when you're fighting with your sister over who gets to have the Barbie doll. The ramifications of this is that obviously because they internalize this narrative of needing to prioritize themselves in every situation, they may have horrible perceptions which leads to negative development of one's character. And what happens then? Why is this so detrimental? Their classmates shy away from them or eschew them or simply alienate or ostracize them altogether because who wants to interact with a selfish person? This means the child will lose out on their social lives. They never learn to properly engage with people successfully, and this trickles down to their adult and professional lives, making it that much harder for them to assimilate into any kind of foreign environment or new culture. Besides, we think that there is literally no necessity because there's literally a counter narrative to prevailing selfish interests because humans are self-prioritizing beings. We are solitary beings. We always want to prioritize ourselves if not taught otherwise. For example, just take a look at a young child. But even if humans weren't self-prioritizing, isn't it true, like what government has conceded, that there's an endless vessel of self-love and self-prioritization messaging in social media and alike and normal media alike? So our second layer was about what interpersonal relationships look like in the corporate world. We say that corporations and companies are more likely to start pushing group dynamics and prioritizing people who are willing to make compromises and cooperate with diverse people. Why is this so? It dissipates into the working culture in two different ways, as we have said. First, in the employment process, because employers are more likely to hire people with great track records and experiences and positive comments about their ability to assimilate into a working environment and essentially add to the glue of the company. And this is helpful in ensuring the gears of the company work smoothly and efficiently. Because its selfish and individual interests are pursued ahead of the collective interest, it breeds distrust and vehement emotions. It fosters poor group dynamics. It makes group projects less expedited and less efficient because if group members are bickering or beefing with each other, this means less time to spend on research or cohesive discussions, etc. The second thing that we talked about was the opportunities during employment. When you pass out group assignments or clearly shun away from trying to help out in any collective interest projects, it sends out the virtual signal to higher-ups that you're self-centered and not going to be passed down for promotional opportunities in managerial roles, because it clearly shows that you have no interest in benefiting anyone but yourself, which means all these factors incentivizes employees or potential job applicants to be more ethical and selfless. And we would like to clarify that this doesn't necessarily mean you don't get the personal benefits later on, because at the end of the day, even if you do collaborate with others, there are personal benefits like promotions, job opportunities. And the selfish benefit at the end of the day doesn't equate pursuing selfish interest, because pursuing selfish interest doesn't guarantee a positive or profitable end goal, but collective interest does guarantee a collective benefit that will in turn trickle down to you as the employee as well. Our second argument was essentially on social justice cases, in which collective interests are pursued. No, thank you. Are pursued ahead of own interest, because if they were to prioritize their own self-interest, these movements are likely to not even going to develop or grow to the extent and enormity that it has grown today, and even start to disintegrate at the foundation. Second, we also talked about the comparison of the two narratives, and Rash essentially talked about the manifestation of selfless narrative in kids. And I think we made it pretty clear that kids don't have perception of the effects of being selfish, and it's only more clear and prevalent in adulthood, where being selfish means you get passed up for promotions, you're not invited out with your colleagues, you're not asked to be part of group projects, all of which is inherently isolating. As a kid, the perception of these effects are severe, but as so much so because as a kid, if you don't understand what empathy is, I think it's unlikely you'll ever act on emotions like guilt or pity. Like if little Sally didn't bring her lunch to school and looked sad and hungry at lunchtime, yes, maybe Timmy would feel sad and guilty about it, but if Timmy's mom never taught him the principle of sharing and how it can affect other people, would Timmy lumber over and share his sandwich? No, I don't think so, because he doesn't understand how giving up something good that he has is going to make other people happy. That is the difference between the two worlds in this debate. Second, we also talked about selfishness in adults, and we talked about how this is they're going to internalize these concepts in the first place from young, and we gave a line of reasoning about how this is going to look like, that people with no incentive to prioritize anyone else but themselves have no incentive to genuinely help others, because it's not serving them unless they come to the realization that, oh, it's going to benefit their social lives and reputation, and thus benefit their professional corporate careers and help them network. Then they are going to help people, but with a disingenuous and deceitful intent instead. In government's world, there are more neglected children because parents have no obligation to take care of kids that did not consent to be born into this world. And this is just another prevalent example of why selflessness is not only necessary for you, but also the lives of others, why it's something you owe your children, and Prop never engage with this. But let's take a step back and analyze what side government has said thus far, and my rebuttals will be incorporated in my analysis. First, they talked about how it is not out of our own volition and that it empowers them to engage in genuine kindness and that there will be more personal growth. First of all, I feel to see how more personal growth would manifest on your side of the house when people are going to always want to prioritize themselves, like what you said. So in what kind of scenario would they be incentivized to want to help others genuinely out of the sheer kindness of their heart? And without having a selfless narrative to counter all the messaging, like what you mentioned in status quo about putting yourself first and prioritizing yourself always first and foremost, going to be more harmful, because isn't personal growth also defined by your interactions and those ripple effects on other individuals? And if people are going to want to prioritize themselves, this looks like several different things. For example, their reputation, because it directly impacts their social or professional lives, meaning it is more likely on Gov's side that people are going to be disingenuous in helping people, because people are going to be more inclined on your side to be selfish and self-serving and deceitful or duplicitous in their supposedly charitable acts. They want to be perceived as kind and generous. And my DL has already said that this would transpire into their future interpersonal relationships, where they fear letting their facade down for fear of losing their likability, insecurity in relationships, or simply being mentally exhausted from always pretending. Second, they talked about how more people are willing to break
before 7.
Conformity, no, and start these social justice movements in the first place. But we talked about how social justice movements require them to take out effort and time and mobilize others and go against heavily established institutions, which could screw up your personal and professional lives by going against the norm. So why would they have any obligation to break out of conformity for the goodwill of others in the first place? Third, they talk about how healthy competition means more positive outcomes. No, please. Panel note that there is no coherent analysis from government side as to the likelihood that this is going to happen, because if Michael and Samantha both stand a chance for the same promotion, they're going to want to fight tooth and bone against each other to stand out and become the most appealing candidate for the promotion instead of a friendly rivalry. In the workplace, friendly rivalries aren't likely to happen. This isn't kindergarten or primary school where you compete with the boy from the next class over for a higher score on your math test. The workplace is more aggressive and hostile, which is why there is more of a need for a selfless narrative which incentivizes people to work together. But finally, our clash is which side enriches individual lives more. Side government gave us extremely soft arguments that are simply untrue. They tell us that people are going to be more likely to engage in genuine kindness, but we dismantled this already in our rebuttal. And they talk about how society is going to be more inclusive, but this is unlikely just from looking at status quo where people cry foul about affirmative action and discriminate more against Black students in universities. In a world that's already struggling to cope with diversity in the workplace and people's sexualities and gender identities, what kind of president does it set if there's no tolerance, there's no willingness to learn to accept other people, all in the name of Zen and peace and tranquility, or of the pursuit of self-interest? But tying back to my opening, let's take a look at little Devesh now, all grown up under his mother's watchful eye and under a selfless mindset. He now gives out sweets to his classmates. He helps old ladies cross busy roads. He goes to debate competitions and defends side op in this motion. If he had skewed towards side government, he will be nothing but a void of self-servitude. And with that, I'd like to end my speech. Thanks.
All right, thank you for the speech. Glad to know Divish is a good boy. With that being said, I'd like to invite Op Reply to conclude the Ops case.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. After about 24 minutes worth of matter from Frog, I finally get why they defend selfishness. Because if they were a charity, they'd be the least charitable charity in the world. Because their lack of genuine engagement with us, talking about taking the case out of context, was almost non-existent. But before I rehash the op case here, some important clarifications that I just have to make here. I think firstly, I don't think Op can do both in this debate. They can't be Bruce Wayne by day and Batman by night, selfish by day and selfless at night. Like seriously, they had to pick a side at some point in the debate, because their lack of a genuine stance throughout 3 speeches was definitely fatal to their case for so many reasons. Because their assertion that came from Prop that without a world with a lack of a counter narrative would still be great and selfless was carelessly dangerous to their case for 2 main reasons. One, it was a direct tension and contention with their own framing, because their framing was that people put up with too much and people are too selfless nowadays. Hence, we need to start to let them self-prioritize. Sure, but then that comes into direct contention with the idea of people are just going to automatically opt for selflessness when they feel the need to do so. So then what exactly is the contention? Do you want people to be selfless or do you want them to be self-prioritizing? You have to pick one. Secondly, there's this dangerous assumption on their side that with the lack of a narrative, people were intuitively going to opt for selflessness when they feel the need to do so. I think this was false for 2 main reasons. One, they never mentioned on the fact that they were going to emphasize selflessness at any point in the debate. So why is this such a quick opt-in for an average reasonable person, insofar as they didn't have this upbringing and this ingraining into them that selflessness is important? Because recognize, panel, how even in status quo, with this present narrative, people still choose to be intuitively selfish. So then I'm uninclined to buy that people with the lack of this narrative were then going to be so benevolently selfless like Gov would posit to you. I think secondly, it's on direct contention with the idea of our framing on as to how people people genuinely are just typically more selfish beings. Like even I was once very, very selfish, but at the end of like Joey's speech, I became super selfless. So I think at the end of the debate, at the end of the day, right, people still are born as selfish individuals. So you have to take that into consideration as Gov. But I'm going to rehash the op case here, and I'm going to prove to you as to why it takes on a broader majority of the Gov case. I think first I want to talk to you on the idea of like social movements and as to how these contribute to things like selflessness. I think we told you right off, like in my speech, on as to how society functions on this intuitively selfless, interested mindset. So we prioritize things like collective interests, and when it comes to these things, because insofar as you want to prioritize things like self-interest when it comes to social movements, you were never going to get things like genuine change, because A, you were either going to breed leaders who are going to only be self-prioritized, you were only going to be self-serving, or 2, you were never going to be able to get the same amount of capital that you were ever going to get because you have to buy that at some point in the debate, because the Gov case clearly lacks a prioritization of selflessness. So I'm uninclined to believe that you are ever going to have similar amounts of capital for perhaps the Me Too movement or the BLM movement, insofar as the lack of this push narrative. They had to concede to that fact. They had to genuinely engage, but no, it was all about being Batman, right? I think secondly, on the major idea on as to how interpersonal relationships are largely going to be affected and how this directly affects things like your career, I think you have to understand that at the end of the debate, selflessness ends up like positing into more like converting into significantly more positive relationships, right? Because we talked to you about how these relationships typically function on the degree of selflessness. So it's not just you being selfless, but it's your partner also being selfless. So I don't think it's necessarily self-sacrificing within certain relationships, but it's more so the idea of whether or not you and your partner are willing to give up certain things for each other. And I think that's just what makes relationships typically work, right? I think that's the genuine idea of relationships. I think secondarily on the idea of careers itself, we talked to you very importantly about how a lot of the development that happened behind careers has to happen behind the idea of selfless mindsets, because insofar as people are just going to be competing individualistically along the people within their company, I think then you just end up having a lack of collaboration, a lot of productivity slows down. I think you're unable to progress in your career. And I think for all those reasons, you have to side with up.
Great, thank you for that fine speech. To conclude the case from government, I'd like to invite the government reply.
Okay. Starting speech in 3, 2, 1. The key flaw within their case is trying to push an extremely unreasonable burden upon us, like saying we're somehow raising children to be selfish, even though we've already characterized you in first that living life without selflessness can coexist and likely would be more self-reliant in second, and then proceed to not even engage with the bulk of the benefit of our case, like self-development, like how we're better able to protect agency and liberty, and never once engage with the societal pressure that we've proven completely goes against the idea of being selfish in the first place. This debate is about which side brings more value and which side is better able to achieve a good life, and how we still win on that on many grounds. They try to push us the burden of an extremely uncharitable stance. We say that if you say we're being very uncharitable, but then want us to defend a world where suddenly everyone would snatch balls from little kids and everyone would suddenly actively act so selfish that no one will actively like you. There are still innate feelings of wanting to help others by virtue of us being social creatures and wanting to find love and wanting to help people we love. And all these are all things that we've already brought to you within first. And even if that we take their uncharitable stance, we will still are the side that is better able to achieve the good life, because you still focus on yourself and be happy and actively doing what you want. And therefore, if you want friends, you still would make them. If you want to make a lot of money, you still are going to make the actions necessary to be able to make more money. But the narrative of being selfish, you still would not want to, you still are going to likely strive for those things. And all of those things have been pushed to you in all three speakers, which already engages with the bulk of their case and engages with their best case scenario. And secondly, the sudden switch within opposition's second speaker, that they suddenly want to help with minorities, and having the first few lines of their speech being about needing to achieve societal change, which our speaker have already engaged to, upon being extremely unlikely to not want, that people are not suddenly going to not want societal change completely, and people still will likely help out of trying to push for justice and trying to actively trying to stop injustice from happening within society, still are things that are going to exist within status quo. And suddenly, don't let opposition try to push to you that suddenly all these things will not ever be achieved just because suddenly people will be selfish, which is already an unfair burden to push onto us anyway. The entire case is hinged upon our individuals suddenly will not help other people out. But within Whip Speaker, we've already told you collaboration does not require selfishness. This is what our second prop has already told you, but even if we assume that selfishness will still exist, we've already engaged you that you still are more likely to burn yourself out on their worst case. And on their best case, note that individuals will never be putting themselves prior to others, which either way is still not living on your own virtue. We tell you as to why the principle we tell you that is completely unresponded to by opposition on liberty is prior to whatever deontological imperative that they want to assert to you. Opposition suddenly keeps trying to push the burden that, oh, we suddenly will no longer help children and we suddenly won't help the grandmothers cross the street. We've already told you in second that it is not true, that our position does not promote neglecting the needs of individuals within our own community of this side of the world. We still recognize the importance of local communities, community engagement, and addressing the societal issues that affect our immediate surroundings. And all of these things have already brought to you within first that we are still better able to help them and still better able to achieve the good life. But even if that's not that does not mean we completely abandon helping people around us. By recognizing the importance of personal well-being and self-interest, individuals can be better equipped to contribute positively to their local community. And with that, happy to propose.
All right, that concludes the quarterfinal. Great debate. Now both teams can virtually cross the floor and shake hand. And I think the judges, looking back at the break room, I think room 2 is empty. Double check again. No, room 2 has people. Shall we move to room 5 in Zoom?